The moment they placed both of my daughters on my chest, two tiny purple-pink faces scrunched up against the cold air of the operating room, I started sobbing so hard that the anesthesiologist actually leaned over and asked if I was in pain. I wasn't. Or maybe I was. It's hard to separate the two when you're lying flat on a table with your abdomen open, counting ceiling tiles, and realizing that the one person who is supposed to be standing beside you, holding your hand, is nowhere in this building. His phone had gone to voicemail 4 times. 4 times! I found out later, weeks later, when I finally had the stomach to piece it together, that while Dr. Nguyen was making the incision, while I was gripping the side rail of that operating table hard enough to leave bruises on my own palm, my husband Garrett was 40 minutes away in a mall in Tyson's Corner, helping a woman named Simone pick out a silk scarf at Nordstrom. His assistant Priya told me everything. She said he looked happy, relaxed, like a man with nowhere to be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I always do when I think about that February. Let me go back to where this actually started, back to the version of my life where I still thought I understood what I had. 7 years. Garrett and I had been married for 7 years when the twins were born, and for most of those 7 years, I genuinely believed I was one of the lucky ones. I know that sounds naive. It probably was. But when you build something slowly, stitch by stitch, the way I build everything, it feels real in a way that's hard to question. I'm a seamstress, have been since I was 19, learned from my grandmother in her cramped sewing room that always smelled like lavender and machine oil. By the time I was 24 and met Garrett at a mutual friend's dinner party in Georgetown, I had my own small alterations and custom orders business running out of a converted spare bedroom. Nothing glamorous. Long hours, finicky clients, fabric swatches covering every flat surface in the apartment. But it was mine. I was proud of it in the quiet, bone-deep way you're proud of things you built with your own hands. Garrett was 31 then. A regional VP at a tech company, on his way up, all easy confidence and a smile that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in whatever room you were standing in. On our 3rd date, he watched me hem a client's vintage gown at my kitchen table while we talked, and instead of being bored or weird about it, he said, "You're the most focused person I've ever seen." I fell in love with him partly for that sentence. We got married in late April, 6 months after we met. Quick, I know, but it felt right in the way some things just do. Small ceremony. His parents, my parents, maybe 30 people in a rented space in Old Town Alexandria. My maid of honor, Claudette, cried before I even walked in. We honeymooned in Portugal, came back tan and happy, and immediately started talking about kids. That part took longer than we expected. 3 years of trying, 2 miscarriages, 1 specialist, a lot of nights where I sat at my sewing machine after Garrett fell asleep and just let myself feel the grief quietly so I didn't have to perform it for anyone. The parakeet helped, strangely. His name is Pico, a green and yellow budgie I'd had since before Garrett and I met, small enough to sit on my shoulder while I worked. On the worst nights, he'd just press his tiny, warm body against the side of my neck and make these low, almost imperceptible chirping sounds, like he was trying to say something he didn't have the words for. I understood completely. The pregnancy finally stuck when I was 30. Twins, they told us at the 8-week ultrasound. Garrett grabbed my hand so hard in that exam room, I thought he might actually crack something. 2, he kept saying on the drive home, shaking his head, grinning at the windshield. 2 at once. Of course it's 2. Those 9 months were the happiest I'd seen him. He painted the nursery himself over 3 consecutive weekends, listened to me describe exactly the shade of warm white I wanted until he got it right. He came to every OB appointment. He installed the car seats 3 weeks early because, he said, he didn't want to be scrambling. I remember thinking, I actually remember the specific thought, I married the right person. I should have been paying more attention to the edges of things, but when you're 31 weeks pregnant with twins in November, waddling around a house in a suburb outside of DC, feeling like your body has been borrowed by the universe for its own purposes, the edges are hard to see clearly. Garrett's brother, Nolan, had been in our lives the entire marriage. Nolan was 3 years younger, 31 at this point to Garrett's 34, and he had what I can only describe as a career in being adjacent to things. He'd worked for Garrett's company briefly, then left. He'd started a consulting side project that I never fully understood. He borrowed money from Garrett, from their parents, with the easy casualness of someone who never truly expected to pay it back. And somehow, it never caused a real fight because Garrett always made excuses for him. "He's just figuring himself out," Garrett would say. "He's had a harder time than people realize." I tried to believe that, I really did. Nolan was charming when he wanted to be. He had the same smile as Garrett, that quality that made you feel seen. And in the early years of the marriage, he'd come to holiday dinners and sit at our table and be genuinely funny and warm. Our mother-in-law, Diane, adored both her sons with a ferocity that made it impossible to criticize either of them without it becoming a referendum on your character. But there were things that nagged at me. Small things, early on. The way Nolan would sometimes look at Garrett's house, our house, with an expression I couldn't quite read. The way he'd make comments about Garrett's success that sounded like compliments, but had something underneath them. Once, maybe 2 years into the marriage, I overheard him on the phone in our guest room, voice low, saying something about, "When Garrett finally wises up." I told myself I'd misheard. I was good at that. The first real alarm, not a distant bell but something closer, something I felt in my chest, came in early February of that year. I was 7 months pregnant. The slush outside was the color of old concrete, the kind of February that feels like the city has given up. I was working from home, which I'd been doing since October, pinning a client's altered blazer to the dress form by the window, when my phone buzzed with a text from Nolan. "Hey Nadia, can we talk? I have something I need to tell you about Garrett. I think you deserve to know." I stared at that text for a long time. Pico shuffled along his perch on the other side of the room and made a short, sharp sound, almost like a question mark. I typed back, "What are you talking about?" The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "Not over text. Can you meet me tomorrow? Just us." My hands had gone still over the blazer. Outside, a city bus hissed through the slush on the street below. I remember the sound very specifically because everything else went quiet. I didn't sleep well that night. Garrett came home at 7:30, kissed my forehead, asked how I was feeling, heated up the soup I'd made, and sat across from me at the kitchen table, talking about a product launch at work. He seemed fine. He seemed like himself. I watched his face the whole time, looking for something I couldn't name. After dinner, he fell asleep on the couch watching basketball, and I sat in the sewing room with Pico on my shoulder, staring at the text from Nolan on my phone screen. The thing about Nolan is that he'd always had a talent for finding the exact place where a story could be twisted. He was good at presenting himself as the reluctant truth-teller, the one who hated to say it, but felt like you needed to hear it. I'd seen him do it to other people, cousins at Thanksgiving, co-workers he'd mentioned in passing. There was always a performance of reluctance before whatever he'd decided to say. I knew all of that, and I still couldn't stop my heart from hammering when I read that text again. "I think you deserve to know." 7 years of marriage, a house we'd picked out together, 2 daughters coming in 2 months, a parakeet named Pico who liked to sleep on my shoulder while I worked, a sewing room that smelled like my grandmother's. I agreed to meet him. We met at a coffee place near DuPont Circle, one of those narrow spots where the tables are too close together and you have to lean in just to hear someone. Nolan was already there when I arrived, both hands wrapped around a mug, and for a moment I stood in the doorway watching him before he saw me. He looked nervous. That was new. Nolan never looked nervous. "Thanks for coming," he said when I sat down. He glanced at my stomach. 7 months, impossible to ignore, and something moved across his face that might have been guilt. "Just say it," I told him. "Whatever it is." He did. He told me about a woman named Simone. He told me she worked in marketing at a firm downtown, that she and Garrett had met at a conference in Chicago 14 months earlier, that Nolan knew because Garrett had told him, had actually told his own brother. confided in him like it was a normal thing to share, like Nolan was just going to hold that information quietly forever. He told me Garrett had been seeing her consistently, that it wasn't a one-time thing, that he had reason to believe it was still ongoing. My hands were flat on the table. I could feel the edge of the wood digging into my palms. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. Nolan looked down at his mug. "Because he asked me to cover for him, last week. Said he needed me to tell you he was with me if you asked about a Friday night." He paused. "I'm not doing that. Not with—" He gestured vaguely at my stomach. "Not with this." I drove home in a kind of suspended silence, the kind where you're operating the car on muscle memory alone, while some other part of your brain tries to process a fact that doesn't fit anywhere. 14 months. The twins were conceived around 8 months ago. The math was simply there, sitting in front of me, not asking permission. I didn't confront Garrett that night. I know people always want to know why, and the answer is that I needed to be sure in a way that didn't depend on Norlando, whose motives I still wasn't entirely certain about. He had the same smile as Garrett. He'd always found ways to insert himself between people. I needed facts that came from somewhere other than his mouth, so I was methodical about it. I am, by nature, a methodical person. You cannot do precision work with fabric and thread without learning to slow down, to check before you cut. I went through credit card statements. Garrett kept his personal card linked to a joint account for household expenses, and he'd never changed that. And I found enough. Restaurant charges for 2 on nights he'd told me he was working late. A hotel in Bethesda. Nordstrom receipts in amounts that didn't correspond to anything he'd ever brought home. I took photos of everything on my phone. I made copies. I put the copies in a folder in my sewing room behind a bolt of heavyweight canvas, in a spot Garrett had never once gone near in 7 years. I also called my mother. My mother, Constance, is a woman who has survived things I won't get into here, and when I told her what I'd found, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds before she said, "Have you called Marcus yet?" Marcus Oyalaran was my mother's attorney, estate work mostly, but he knew family law, and more importantly, he knew things about my family that I had been careful not to discuss with Connor, not out of deception, out of a kind of privacy that had always felt right to me. Garrett knew I came from money on my mother's side. He'd met my grandparents, attended family events. What he'd never asked about, and what I'd never volunteered in explicit detail, was the structure of what my grandmother Vivian had built, and what I stood to inherit. My grandmother Vivian Hartwell had founded a logistics and supply chain company in 1981. She was 79 now and still on the board. The company, Hartwell Integrated, had grown into one of the 3 largest privately held logistics corporations on the East Coast. My mother was the primary heir. I was next in line. I had known this my entire adult life, the way you know things that feel abstract until suddenly they don't. It was always in the background, always real, but not something I led with. Not something I thought about when I was pinning hems or arguing about which shade of white to paint a nursery. Garrett, I now realized, had never understood what he was married to. Not because I'd hidden it, because he'd never bothered to ask. I called Marcus. I told him to start the paperwork. Then I waited, because I was 37 weeks pregnant with twins, and my body was making its own schedule regardless of what was happening in my marriage, and the girls were coming whether the rest of my life was sorted or not. They came on a Tuesday in February. I went into labor at 2 in the morning, called my mother, called Claudette, called the hospital. I called Garrett 4 times. 4 times it went to voicemail. I left one message. I said the girls were coming. I said which hospital. I said he needed to come now. I have already told you what he was doing instead. Dr. Nguyen delivered both girls by C-section at 6:47 and 7:03 in the morning. My mother was in the waiting room. Claudette held my hand during prep and talked to me about absolutely nothing, the drive over, the temperature outside, a recipe she'd been meaning to try, in the steady, deliberate way you talk to someone who needs to stay calm. The anesthesiologist was named Dr. Faruqi, and he had a very reassuring voice. I focused on that. When they put both girls on my chest, I named them right then, on the table, which is not the order Garrett and I had planned. We'd said we would decide together, in the room, with both of us present. He wasn't present. I named them Vivian, for my grandmother, and Clara, which had been on our list and which I had always loved more than he did anyway. Garrett arrived at 9:14, according to the timestamp on the security footage that I later obtained through my attorney. I know this because by 9:14, I had already been moved to recovery, my mother was with me, and I had already made 2 phone calls, one to Marcus and one to my grandmother. He walked into the recovery room with flowers, actual flowers, a bouquet from the hospital gift shop, still in the plastic sticker with the price sticker visible. He looked like a man who understood, at least partially, what he had done, and was hoping the flowers would function as a bridge across it. "Nadia," he said, "I'm so sorry. I lost track of—" "Don't," I said. I wasn't crying. I was holding Vivian, and Clara was in the bassinet beside me, and my mother was sitting in the chair by the window with a look on her face that I recognized from the 4 seconds of silence when I'd told her about the credit card statements. "I want to explain," he said. "Priya told me you were at Nordstrom," I said. "She told me you looked relaxed." His face did something complicated. He set the flowers on the windowsill, which was already crowded with my mother's things, and they half fell against the glass. "How long has it been going on with Simone?" I asked. The way he flinched at the name told me everything. Not just that it was true, but that he had genuinely believed he had more time before that name reached me. "Nadia, how long, Garrett?" It wasn't." He stopped, started over. "It's over. I ended it. I know what I did was wrong, and I need you to know that Marcus filed the paperwork on February 9th, I said, 3 days ago. I need you to sign the voluntary disclosure form when he contacts you. It'll go faster if you're cooperative." He stared at me. When did you—" "I found the statements in January," I said, "after Nolan told me." I watched him process that. The knowledge that his own brother had told me. The knowledge that I had spent weeks being methodical about this, while he'd apparently spent those same weeks believing nothing would change. "Nolan," he said, and his voice had something in it that wasn't grief about our marriage. It was the sound of a man recalculating a relationship with his brother. That wasn't my problem anymore. "You should know something else," my mother said from the chair by the window. She hadn't moved. Her voice was very calm, the way it always is when she's decided something is finished. "Vivian, my mother, named Nadia as co-executor of the Hartwell Trust last fall. The board voted on the succession structure in December." She paused. "I imagine Priya may have mentioned something about that to you as well, on your way up here." He looked at my mother, then at me, then at the baby in my arms. I found out later from Priya herself, who sent me a message 3 weeks after that morning, that when Garrett had finally gotten back in his car at the mall parking garage, she had called him before he'd even started the engine. She'd told him I was in surgery. She'd told him to get to the hospital immediately. And then, because Priya is a precise person who believes in complete information, she'd told him that my grandmother Vivian Hartwell had been in contact with the hospital to arrange transport, that there was a helicopter on standby on the hospital roof, chartered through Hartwell Integrated's aviation account, for when I and the girls were cleared to be moved. That she had looked up my family during the pregnancy because she always researched the personal lives of the executives she supported, and she had found my connection to Hartwell, and she had thought he should know that. "Your wife," Priya had told him, according to what she later shared with me, "is the heiress to a top 3 corporation. You might want to reconsider how this morning looks." He'd driven 40 minutes to the hospital in what I imagine was a very specific kind of panic. The helicopter was real. My grandmother had arranged it as a precaution because twins born at 37 weeks sometimes need specialized neonatal support, and the facility she'd arranged had a unit she trusted. Vivian and Clara didn't need it, as it turned out. Both girls were small but healthy, cleared within 24 hours. But the helicopter was there on the roof, and Garrett saw it when he arrived, and something about the sight of it seemed to complete a picture for him that he hadn't been able to see before. I didn't leave on the helicopter. We went home in my mother's car, the girls in their car seats, Pico making noise from the other room when we walked in. I took the girls to the sewing room first, I don't know why, instinct, and stood there in the smell of lavender and machine oil with one of them in each arm, looking at the dress form by the window and the fabric swatches on the shelves, and the little perch where Pico was watching us all with his head tilted, and I thought, this is still mine. All of this is still mine. The divorce took 11 months. Garrett was cooperative, as I'd asked, because Marcus made clear that the alternative was a discovery process that would be expensive and public and would not reflect well on anyone. He kept the house. His name had always been primary on the mortgage, and I didn't want it. I took a settlement that my grandmother's attorneys negotiated, and the number was fair, and it reflected 14 months of infidelity documented with receipts, literally with receipts. Simone, as far as I know, is no longer with Garrett. I heard through Claudette, who heard through someone else, that it ended about 3 months after everything came out. I don't know the details, and I don't particularly want them. Nolan called me once, a few months after the filing. He said he was sorry it had come to this. I told him I appreciated what he'd done in February, and I meant it, even knowing his motives were probably complicated. He'd done the right thing. For whatever mix of reasons people do right things. That was enough. Clara and Vivian are 2 years old now. Clara has my grandmother's eyes, this very specific shade of gray-green that I'd always thought was unique to Vivian Hartwell, and apparently skipped a generation to land here. The older one, Vivian, has my stubbornness. My mother says she can already tell. She'll stand at the edge of the playmat with her feet planted, deciding whether she wants to go forward, and she will take exactly as long as she needs, and then she will move. I moved my sewing business out of the spare bedroom. I have a proper studio now, a rented space in a building near Capitol Hill with tall north-facing windows and enough room for 3 machines and 2 cutting tables. I have 3 people who work with me part-time.